of sorts in Sunderland and terribly cross in Kent. They're dull in Hull and the Isle of Mull is seething with discontent. They're nervous in Northumberland and Devon is down the drain. They're filled with wrath on the Firth of Forth and sullen on Salisbury Plain. In Dublin they're depressed lads, maybe because they're Celts, for Drake is going west, lads, and so is everyone else. Hooray, 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 misery's on the way. There are bad times just around the corner. There are dark clouds hurtling through the sky.
We are the guests today of Rod Liddle, columnist, writer, journalist, all about polemicist, a man who has built a big reputation in journalism. And full disclosure, I used to be one of his underlings. I worked for him. So we go back a few years, and those were happy years, I might say. But Rod, we've come up here today to talk to you about God and about religion. I wonder if we could start, do you think about this much? Is this question, this big existential question about God and the meaning of life, are these things which actually concern you at all?
Yeah, every day without fail. It's the bedrock of my philosophical standpoint, and its contradictions and its difficulties, and how we align that with the modern world, and how we do so badly, are the things which as I say, it's about my philosophy. It's more about my journalism, which is that within it, even though I'm a believer, there are so many delicious contradictions which make me laugh out loud, and which I think make everybody laugh out loud when you lay them out. There is such fertile ground for journalism, and not many people do it because they think God is really wouldn't go there. You know, one shouldn't go there, but one should. And it's also important. I had a conversation about 4 years ago now with Charles Murray, the great American sociologist, who, when I talked to him about Europe and what was happening in Europe generally in terms of social policy, and he laughed long and loud and he said, "Yeah, you're trying to, you Europeans are trying this experiment where you just get rid of God, but don't put anything in his place. Let's all see how that works out for you." And that is exactly my perspective and the thing which drives the journalism I do, far more than politics.
It's interesting because I agree with you entirely that it's a topic which people actually avoid, either through embarrassment or a sort of reticence about personal belief, because of course these things do go very deep. So if you're going to talk about these things, they are actually, it does mean a degree of personal exposure, doesn't it?
It does, yes, it does. I mean, a few years ago, again, I wrote a book called Selfish Whining Monkeys, which was about how I felt my generation had turned out. And I mean, the first thing in it, it's virtually the first thing I come to, is our attempt to abolish God. And there are two sides to that. There is firstly abolishing the fairly straightforward, plain and easily understood shibboleths which accompany God, i.e. religion. And I think we've lost that to our detriment because we haven't managed to put anything in its place properly. And secondly, there's also the idea of getting rid of God itself and what that does to us. And I think one of the interesting things is I have a grave problem with people who have an inviolable certitude about anything. I think that's where an awful lot of our problems come from. And you might therefore think that humanists would be averse to certitude. Oh boy. Because as soon as you abolish God, the thing you put in its place is us. And that's what the humanists have done. And I remember, I think it was, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, this philosopher, whose name mercifully I've forgotten, decided that there ought to be a tower built in London to celebrate humanism. I mean, you don't need me to highlight the absurdity and the biblical connotations of this, and that it would be a tower of life on earth with the achievements of mankind picked out in gold. And that vaulting arrogance and that refusal, that lack of humility. I suggested that the achievements of mankind ought to be picked out in Einsteinium, or one of those wonderful isotopes which was actually created in the Ivy Mike explosion when they destroyed the Marshall Islands back in 1953. They're one of those isotopes which kills everybody but only lasts for about 5 minutes. But it's that lack of humility, and again that certitude. Poor old Richard Dawkins, a man I respect actually for his publicising of science, of which the public is woefully ignorant, etc., did for a long time become one of those people possessed of a kind of religious certitude that God didn't exist. Yeah. And you would say to Richard, come on.
Yes.
You cannot, as a scientist, tell me that God doesn't exist, and you know that.
Yeah.
And he would say, no, I can't, but, and the buts would come up. And sorry.
No, I was just thinking that, Dawkins, and this rather fascinating, it wasn't exactly recanting his position, but when he said, he just last year, he said about how, well, religion, he doesn't much care for organised religion, but if he was going to have any religion, it would be Christianity.
Well, you see, I think there's two things. He's no fool, Dawkins. And he may have harmed his scientific reputation in the last 15 years a bit as well. But two things have happened. Firstly, I think he has probably become a little distraught at his own certitude and understands that it really shouldn't have been part of the deal. And secondly, he's certainly become worried about the rise of Islam, about which he has been a principled and quite bravely outspoken adversary in many ways.
It's interesting what you say about certitude, because I think anybody who counts themselves a believer, as I do, would also has to admit frankly and candidly that to be without doubt would be unnatural.
Yeah.
It's actually that I'm convinced of the belief of God, but every now and then, you wake in the wee small hours and you think, what is this thing, what is this all about? And
the person who put it perfectly, as ever, was Betjeman. Not my vegetarian dinner, not my lime juice minus gin, quite can drown the faint conviction that we may be born in sin. And it's that line, faint conviction, and that's what I have. It's that oxymoron. I have a faint conviction.
When you think about this, I mean, do you ever? I mean, this is an impossible thing, really. But how do you actually envisage God? But perhaps envisage is the wrong word. But what is your conception of God? Is it as the creator or what?
I have a feeling of being observed, of being watched and judged. I like to think that is the God I'm thinking of. If it isn't, I'd like it to remain anyway, because I think it's a good thing to think you are being watched and observed and judged on your actions.
And the conscience comes into that, of course.
My conscience. Yes, no, absolutely, yes. It's tied up with conscience. And it's a very interesting thing that there's been this enormous retreat away from God. And that was really a factor of the 19th century and the rise of scientism and the rise of sociological and political paradigms which kind of in a religious way talked about historical inevitability. and in the terms of Comte and people like this, a gradual but delineated procession of society towards an end. And I think that stuck with us throughout the 20th century, and that kind of was taken up and became, which is why we saw the decline of churches throughout the 20th century. I do think it's slightly changing now. You know, I read a lot of fiction by quite poncy writers, and very good writers. And you just see this yearning, for a God, and also the belief that there must be one. And coterminously, if you keep abreast of modern physics, it is edging ever closer towards the idea of the sheer improbability of our existence. Yeah. The fact that though they haven't admitted it yet, we're almost certainly alone in this vast universe. And the way in which quantum mechanics works, the way in which, as Einstein put it, spooky action at a distance, all this stuff just nudges you slightly towards the idea that there may be some guiding hand at the back of all this. Yeah. And I would go no further than that. I think that the person who explained it very well under his own terms, and of course he was a Episcopalian and a lover of Paul Tillich, so I wouldn't necessarily go along with him the whole way, but John Updike in Roger's version, which was kind of a rewrite of Nathaniel Hawthorne, but was also talking about how science is, you can just begin to see the glimmer of God in what we're studying here. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it certainly seems that over the last 15 to 20 years, contrary to what's happened in public affairs, on the media, in TV, in politics, that God has slightly crept back in rather than got away further. I think the time he went away further was the 19th century, and I think there's been a gradual rethinking about this.
It's we were just talking there, I was thinking that a few weeks ago we were down with Jonathan Ruffer and his Faith Museum, and what struck me about that, actually, going to that place, and it's a great museum, well worth a visit, I thought, but it's also the man's search for meaning. I know it's a pretentious thing to say, but there is actually an inescapable yearning in mankind, I think, to explain ourselves to ourselves. And this search for meaning is given expression in religion and religions of all type and sacred ritual of all type. And this is something we're all involved in, like it or not, because otherwise, what is it to be human?
Well, otherwise, what it is, and this is why I think towards the end of the 20th century and now into our century, was the growth of quasi-religious political movements, which were 100 times fouler than the things which they'd represented, than the things which they'd replaced. And so you saw the rise of fascism, particularly Nazism, which posited a spiritual element, a deep spiritual element of blood and soil and connectedness to the land. And that didn't turn out too good. And by the same token, communism, which talked about historical inevitability and that God was banished and all that, and that didn't turn out too good.
It didn't.
No, and so I think what you need as we search for meaning, you have to have a certain humility.
It's interesting you keep coming back to that, because I think that is exactly the point.
It is, yeah.
That actually, to acknowledge ourselves as being not sovereign, so to acknowledge our own insignificance and our own inability to comprehend who we are, what it is we're about, and what life actually consists of. This, to acknowledge that and to admit to the possibility of a creator, of course, involves humility. That involves man looking himself in the mirror and saying, yes, but, I am not the sovereign.
And the problem, of course, is that but disappears if you remove God.
Of course. Tell me then, going back to your childhood, early life, were there religious influences at that time, or was it? No, was it? So
very much. Yeah. I mean, the most. My family was split. I'm the only child, but the family was split. My mum was from the working class Bermondsey background, which is how I become a Millwall supporter. And so. And my dad was from, and hers was a slightly less respectable working class. I think she had a faint liking for Mosley. Let's not go there anyway. My dad, meanwhile, was from the very respectable County Durham, Teesside, Northumberland, working class, very, very Methodist. And a lot of the towns and villages around here, which is a lot of my relatives are from this godforsaken outpost of Kazakhstan that we're actually living in at the moment, for God knows why. But a lot of live in the villages around here, and there's one in particular, West Auckland, which is split down the middle. You've got the Methodists on one side, and you've got the Taigs, the left footers, the Caths on the other side, and you can tell the difference between which one is which, because the Methodist ones have tidy gardens, Robin, tidy gardens, and so I was always brought up with this slightly sectarian. Went to church every Sunday. Was renowned until the age of about 7 for running up to hold the vicar's hand during the sermon, which you probably wouldn't do these days, I think, and went inviolably at least once on a Sunday, usually twice. I used to enjoy evensong, which is a very low church thing to do, but I always enjoyed that. And without question, the most important day in my northern family's life, and this was once we'd moved up to the north, we moved up when I was 7 to Middlesbrough, was when their church in Darlington was on Songs of Praise. And we all huddled. It's like the moon landing had nothing on this, we were all. So yeah, no, it was always present. It made Sundays boring. I didn't mind the church services. I did mind not being allowed to play on a Sunday.
That rigidity.
Yes.
Actually, I think that is something which, it's a mistake for the churches, and it puts people off, doesn't it?
It does. And don't forget, this was a Methodist church, which isn't too bad. We went up to visit. I remember when I was 6, we went up to visit my father's even more northern relatives who lived in Cullen on the east coast of Scotland, and they were wee frees. And by God, I was glad to get back to Methodism. I was allowed to do nothing. I wasn't even allowed to smile on a fucking Sunday. I'm sorry, but what a miserable doer bunch of bastards they were. But I kicked religion when I was 13, 14, my mum was taken seriously ill. I had a lot of very bad dreams, largely supernatural bad dreams, because I was reading a lot of God, it's age, isn't it?
No.
It's age. Ray Bradbury at the time.
Oh, right,
People like
very, very vivid stuff.
Brilliant stuff.
But,
and I'd also been reading a lot of Marxism, and I decided I was a Marxist, that none of this was relevant. And it was quite useful for a time, having that degree of imbecilic rigour in my life. And it is imbecilic. And it was only when I got to my early 20s that I realised that everything that Karl Marx thought was false consciousness matters far more than the economics he rooted his entire belief around. So a feeling of nationhood, God, the family, etc.
See, I think that's a very common pattern, actually. Well, I went through it to an extent myself, that in late adolescence, I sort of moved away from organised religion. I think that's a very natural thing, don't
Yeah.
you? Yeah, I think it's very natural for young
You have
people.
to rebel.
You do a bit. And then I think if you do start thinking then later about what life is about and actually about values and ways of living, what I've always thought is that Christian rules for living are a recipe for, yes, a quite disciplined, but also the kind of life which is going to make most people happy.
Yeah.
Or makes for contentment, at least.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, that what we've done in shedding God, and I think the latest assisted dying debate is obviously part of that, is we haven't replaced it with any sense of principle or any dignifying theory as to what we should be doing. What we've simply done is say about the things which were associated with the belief in God. These are inconvenient. It's about inconvenience. And then you look at the harm which has been done. So, I mean, the obvious one, the most obvious one to me, was the reform of the Divorce Laws Act. Absolutely catastrophic for the poorest people in this country. You know, I stood outside Middlesbrough Jobs Centre. I was doing a piece for the Sunday Times on something else, as it happens. But I just did a bit of amateur sociology and just stayed there for an entire morning until about 110 people had come out. Every single one was the product of a broken home. Every one. And the majority, something like 80%, had gone on to form broken relationships of their own. And it had absolutely fucked them. Yeah. They were absolutely wrecked. They were wrecked spiritually, but they were wrecked financially. They couldn't move somewhere to get another job because they had to go and see their kids. The women couldn't work, you know.
I know.
And so why we introduced it was particularly for the middle class. And they were the first people to divorce. The middle classes were the first people to divorce. And I remember when I was at school, my best mate who was middle class, his parents divorced, and it was utterly unheard of at the time, you know, just weird. But then it was taken up by the working class, and every subsequent attempt to reform the divorce laws further has made it easier and easier for people to make decisions which have, in the end, ruined their lives. It means, for example, that they get married too easily. I can always get out of this. No problem there. Yeah. They have kids too easily. You know, why shouldn't I? Don't judge me, Robin. Yeah. I'll have 5 kids.
Exactly. You see, I agree with you entirely about this, and I think that family instability, the lack of family formation, is what has undermined so many individuals and communities. I mean, it's utterly disastrous for child rearing. It's because it's the children who are the. But what interests me though, Rod, is that you have been a senior journalist. You know, in the media class, you were the editor of the Today programme. That's an important programme. That subject about divorce and the damage which unstable families have created in society is never put centre stage, is it, in the public discourse? Now, and the question is, why is that so? Why is it, do you think, that our politicians and our media avoid this subject?
They don't avoid it particularly. It just doesn't remotely occur to them. They are incapable of putting those two and two together, and yet they're incontestable.
Yeah, I agree.
It's incontestable. Now, it may be, let's be the devil's advocate for a moment, the divorce was too difficult, and there were certainly things about the reform of the divorce laws which were beneficial. So it enabled, as you would always be told, women to get out of abusive relationships. And it did.
Of course.
And it gave them a degree of independence, as did the march of women into the workforce, which is another issue which we never look at the hidden consequences of. And the trouble is, the left is so stupid because it doesn't have because the ideology is incoherent. It simply will not go near subjects because it fears them. And so with divorce, you can't possibly argue against. How dare you? There's no rationality to the argument. All I'm saying is that it's made an awful lot of people's lives worse and cost society an awful lot of money.
I mean, we both know the BBC from the inside, and this is certainly not a debate which I had ever heard inside the BBC.
No.
I mean, you just would not hear
But
this.
nor would you, again, on another issue, which I've come to a little more latterly, and I'm still not 100% certain about. I'm not 100% certain about anything in you know, David Lammy's a moron. I'm 100% certain about that. But other than that, I don't have much certitude. But abortion is another issue. And it's tied in with assisted dying.
Yes.
And it's all very well Justin Welby getting up and talking about how pressure is brought to bear on the elderly and he doesn't, but without mentioning God. Because he knows that the reason he has misgivings about assisted dying is because of God. And he dare not say it. And he's the fucking Archbishop of Canterbury. And if he can't say it, who can? You know, but abortion is very much the same thing. You will never hear within the BBC an argument about, well, abortion... When you see, when they cover protests outside abortion clinics, it never, ever addresses the issue as to whether the abortion clinic is doing a good thing.
No.
Never does it.
No.
It is taken for granted that it is.
Yes.
You know, and there are other things where, you know, I mentioned the March of Women into the Workforce, which came with the Equal Pay Act, an enormous sociological change, and undoubtedly, and this is why I loathe the certitude of the liberal left. Undoubtedly good things occurred as a consequence of that. Women had independence for the first time and were able to earn money, were able to go out to work, live their own lives, etc., etc. But it also had other ramifications. It meant that we now had double-income families and no-income families. So it exacerbated the divide between rich and poor. The other thing it did was, and we look at our obesity crisis at the moment, it meant that no longer did families have someone who was there to cook a meal of an evening, cook a meal of a lunchtime for kids coming home from school. It meant that everyone was time poor and so on and so on. I'm not saying that women should get back into the kitchen. Certainly not my wife, who's an awful cook. But you have to look at what these unforeseen, if you're a moron, consequences are. And that is one of them. And it's led to feral kids. It's led to kids not having a proper parenting. It's led to the obesity crisis we have. And there are other reasons as well, fast food and processed food, etc., etc. But they have grown at the same time that we have found it necessary to use them. You know, they've filled a hole where previously it was my mum, when I came home, cooking something which was nutritious, if not wildly palatable for supper. You know what I mean?
I do. It's funny that, I mean, you probably don't recall this, but when I was working for you, I put up an idea for a series of reports about the pro-life movement in America. And I went across and I did a series of, I think I did 3 or 4 different reports. And I talked actually to the original Jane Roe, who was a woman called Norma McCreevy, who was the actual woman at the centre of the original Roe v. Wade.
Oh, right, yeah.
And the point about, I mean, the reason I mentioned that was because you weren't wildly enthusiastic, as I recall, about the idea, but you took seriously the proposal I was putting forward on it, because I thought it was interesting, the pro-life movement. You know, you don't hear much on the BBC
No.
from a pro-life perspective.
Well, you never do.
You never do.
You just never do.
Or if you do, it's always filtered through a rather negative
Yes,
filter.
yes, of course, yeah.
So they are presented as some sort of wild bigots who just don't understand modern life and that a woman's right to choose, etc., ad infinitum. And talking now, as we're in the run-up to this debate about assisted dying, when we think what the consequence of the Abortion Act was, where it was supposed to be a compassionate act which would result in a limited number of abortions and would save women from having to go to backstreet butchers.
Which we are all glad.
Which we are all glad of course. But the assisted dying bill, of course, presents us possibly with the same slippery slope. I know it's a cliche, but there is that danger, isn't there?
There is that danger, and I find it difficult to. I don't know entirely where I stand on assisted dying, but I tend towards. I tend towards feeling that it is wrong morally.
Yes.
It may be inconvenient, to oppose assisted dying, but it's still probably the right thing to do. And that's why I thought it was, if I'm honest, I thought it was outrageous of Justin not to mention that there is something from his religion which he believes in, supposedly, and that isn't even worth mentioning, the sanctity of life.
What does that tell you, do you think, about the Church of England?
Oh, well, I think the Church of England has, in a way, it's done the opposite to Islam. The Church of England has tried to survive by adapting to every single new liberalish idea that has come along.
It has.
Whereas Islam has done the opposite. But Islam has been successful, and the Church of England is losing people hand over fist. And what you're seeing instead is a growth of the Pentecostalists, the Baptists, the people who sing "Oh Happy Day" with very smiley faces and so on.
I've been a great consumer of your writing over the years, and I think, well, and no one pays me, amazingly.
No.
But, anyway, so I have. And I think I have detected in you a shift. So, I hate the cliche, but, we are all on a journey, Rod, are we not?
Are we not? Yes.
We are all on a journey.
Yeah,
and I wonder if do you see your position as having shifted on these matters, on the matter of God and of religion? Are you now, do you think, at a sort of final destination, or do you see yourself?
No, I think my journey is overseen by LNER, so I'm probably going to be perpetually in a siding at Doncaster for most of this journey. You've detected a change. What sort of change?
Well, I think that what I have seen in your writing is that you have become more socially conservative, if I can put it that way. So you have become more explicitly socially conservative. So, for instance...
That's the word.
Yes.
Explicitly.
Yes.
I always was, mate.
Yes.
But it was... partly... being in the BBC, I can remember saying to someone who I thought was quite an open-minded colleague at the BBC, what do you think about... Don't you think abortion's a bit questionable? But the stridency of the reply brooked no argument. And that was the BBC arguing, And I think I think it's to my discredit that while at the BBC, I didn't do enough which questioned the philosophy of the BBC.
Well, it's not easy because it's a very coercive internal culture.
Yeah.
And if you put your head above the parapet, you don't make yourself popular.
Yeah, but sorry, but my shtick is that I've always put my head above the parapet.
Yes.
I've always...
But you were making your way.
Yeah, I could have been a bit more... I could have been a bit more imaginative
Yes.
about how we dealt with those issues then. I was very clear, I might have told you this before, and this is away from religion in a sense, but the sheer consensus of views at the BBC. And there were a couple of people who differed from that. And I can remember, you remember the wranglings over the exchange rate mechanism?
I do.
And Maastricht and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember one Today programme morning meeting before I was editor, when Roger Mosey was editor, when everyone was sat around laughing at Bill Cash and laughing at Nicholas Ridley and laughing at all the Maastricht lot who were going on about it. And that was the view.
Yeah.
And I can remember Roger Mosey saying, OK, what if they're right? And this kind of appalled silence fell on the room, but at least he said it.
Yes.
At least he said it.
Yes. Well, Mosey was one of those who thought for himself, and actually in my own experience, he was one of the good guys, I thought, because I thought that he was prepared to think outside that consensus.
He was. And actually, on two other issues, abortion, for which he had personal reasons, nonetheless, because I don't think he was terribly religious, Rog.
I don't think so.
But one other issue, where, again, with the BBC and with the media in general, there has been absolute consensus, and to my view, the consensus is wrong. And that is about the women who gave up children for adoption in the 50s and 60s, and even into the early 70s, and who are now attempting to get some sort of redress for that. You will not find anyone, it's BBC or many other places, who will say, but actually, what we did at the time was we put the primacy, the most important thing for us was the kid.
Of course.
So we wanted the kid to be brought up properly. Yeah. OK, that necessarily relegated the woman. Today, the woman is the most important thing, and she's been transgressed. And it's presented in such a way that society took these children away. And it did, because society was of one mind that the children needed to be brought up in a comfortable, happy atmosphere, yes, with two parents, yes, which is the best way to bring up a child.
And there is so much double-think.
It's double-think.
And double talk,
yeah,
about this very issue of putting children first, because people pay lip service to that all the time.
Don't. They never put children first.
They never do. Exactly, no. So.
And that's the same over so many things. But schooling, yeah, and the modern one is mobile phones. Mobile phones, we give kids, excuse me, we give children mobile phones for our convenience, not for theirs.
No. Do you see yourself ever actually being re-embraced by the body of the Kirk? I mean, do you see yourself as returning...
the next Pope? Yes.
No, but returning to organised religion, is that possible?
Sometimes. I mean, I when we were living in southeast England, I went to... I quite regularly walked 2 miles to go to the local Church of England church, until the day when we had to pass a giant ball around the room.
A giant ball?
A giant orange ball around the room to show the iniquity of air miles and our food. If you accept...
What's the biblical reference to that?
There was none whatsoever. If you kind of accept that in that church there were about 13 or 14 congregants, and that I was the youngest by about 30 years, this ball nearly finished a couple of them. I'm telling you, mate, as it bounced around. And I just thought, I can't do this. This is just an absurdity. Since then, on Teesside, I went to the Methodist Church in Teesside, this beautiful old Wesleyan chapel, massive, massive. So massive that the services were held in the foyer, and again it was 9 people, and it's pathetic of me, but you know, I'll say my prayers rather than wander along there and listen to left liberal toss, which inevitably comes out.
Yeah.
The Methodist Church, I mean, in fairness to the Methodists, it always was a left-leaning church.
Yes, it was.
And I'm left.
But it was born almost, wasn't it, out of a concern for social conditions of the poor.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
and some people argue that without Wesley, we would have had a revolution.
Yes. So it was a gospel. It was a social gospel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But it swallowed too much of what I think is the new left. I don't have any problem with women vicars, particularly. You know, I have a bit of a problem with a tranny being a vicar, if I'm absolutely honest. I know it's probably irrational of me and ungodly, but fucking sort yourself out, mate. You know, come on. Sorry, we digress. You can cut that, just in case.
Yes, I think I'd have misgivings about her.
Well, there's one up the road in Edmund by us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You see,
we came here and we thought, we're away from it all. We're away from jihadis trying to stab us. We're away from our children being told that it would be beneficial if they changed sex. We're in old England. Oh, it's here.
And the lesson from that is that the revolution has happened.
Yes.
Now, you said earlier in this interview, you said that you sensed and you had noted how, in a way, God was edging back into the picture. And I agree with you, actually. I have detected, I don't know whether you agree with this, but I've detected an undercurrent. I think that Christianity and religious belief have become countercultural.
It has become countercultural, and therefore, in that kind of weird sort of way, more attractive and has a certain cachet about it. But it is also the aridity of both scientism and capitalism. They are both arid, soul-destroying ideologies and leave most thinking people. What does it leave them? It leaves them
unsatisfied.
Yes, deeply unsatisfied and questing.
Yes.
And thinking that there is something missing that is large in my life, and it is missing, and I don't understand what it is. And that therefore you perhaps do gravitate towards Christianity or towards Islam or Buddhism or one of those religions. And I think that's, you know, certainly reading fiction, the more... the deeper novelists that we have, you're just beginning to see that a lot more than you would have done 30 to 40 years ago, for example, or even 20 years ago. That this notion of spirituality and of an absence in our lives is now becoming a bit of a clamour rather than a mere quiet complaint. It's becoming a clamour.
Isn't it? And I would say that all the best and most serious literature, fiction, always takes this question seriously at some point.
Yeah.
So you cannot... Writing about the human condition, which is what the best novelists do, the genius novelists confront this question, which is, what are our lives about and what do they mean? And I mean, it sounds hopelessly pretentious to say that, but that is what literature is about.
It is what literature is about. And in fairness, I think some of the people who I read would probably resist what I'm saying and may not be conscious that that's what's creeping back in. But someone like David Mitchell, I don't mean that horrible little smug comedian. I mean the novelist.
The Cloud Atlas.
Cloud Atlas.
Yes.
it's there throughout.
It is.
It is there throughout, and throughout all of his other work as
Yes.
well.
I agree. Absolutely. I've just read something by him, and actually the same thought struck me.
Well, The Thousand Summers of Jacob de Zoet, which I think is his best book.
A marvellous book. And if anyone has not read that book, we both strongly recommend it.
We do.
It's an excellent book.
And, John Gray.
John Gray.
Who I don't know where he is. I do know that his social conservative pessimism must have its root somewhere.
Have you ever spoken to him about that?
Yeah. No, I haven't spoken to him directly about that. I mean, my favourite of his is The Silence of the Animals, which is a wonderful book. But other writers. I mean, less known. I think Chris Beckett, who wrote Eden, Dark Eden, which is in many ways a parable based upon Adam and Eve. It's there, and he deals with the formation of religion and so on. I don't remember, when I was growing up and went through this period between the age of 13 and 20 where I did nothing but read. I just read and read and read, and particularly an awful lot of fiction. And really the only one of those writers who I read who dealt directly with religion and God was John Updike. And Updike's view at that time was that it was being replaced by sex as a new religion, which was quite a canny thing to have written in 1968.
It was.
Which was couples.
Yes.
But the rest of it wasn't really there.
Yes.
It was about more down-to-earth political stuff at the time and so on. But it's come back in a big, big way. And I think it's come back listening to some contemporary music. I think my wife's just left home. Just sort of walking towards the car. It's gone. Fuck. Contemporary music, you see it in art. And again, and I'd love to debate this with Brian Cox, who is a good thing and a decent man. But you do begin to see it in physics as well, I think.
Tell me, to begin winding this conversation up, I mean, are you optimistic? Do you see signs of, these things we've been talking about, this sort of hyper-liberalism which we have lived through, and the damage that has done...
As Gray calls it, yeah.
The damage that has done to family formation, to children, the way that it has actually corroded the very basis of our communities in so many fundamental ways. Do you see any signs of that, of a corrective course?
Well, I'd say there's certainly been a corrective course on the transgender stuff.
There has.
I mean, there's been well, as soon as you get a vapid politician like Sebastian Coe suddenly switching sides and saying, actually, no, we women only in the women's stuff. Well, when someone who is just basically a sort of asinine yes man can actually make that journey, then you know that the tide has shifted. And I think the tide has shifted. Well, more and more athletes are speaking out, and therefore more and more liberals feel that they can switch sides as well. You've seen an awful lot of women journalists fleeing The Guardian and getting... And the remarkable thing, Robin, is that they get the hell out of The Guardian on the trans issue, which is an absurdity. The trans issue is an absurdity. And they come to The Telegraph or to the Sunday Times or to The Spectator, and you can see the scales falling from their eyes on all the other shit. Suddenly it's, hang on, maybe we have got too many immigrants in the... Maybe, maybe feminism doesn't answer all of our... And you can see it. And it's marvellous.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it is, as you say, and it is an observable phenomenon.
Yeah.
Because there've been quite a few of these.
Quite a few of them. And you're now getting all these books through, and I forgot the title of them, which are feminist, but which question the old shibboleths of feminism.
Yes. How does, just before we finish, how did these religious, inchoate sort of religious ideas of yours, how do they intersect with your politics? Because you have been active in the Social Democratic Party, and I know that you still are, and you actually stood as a candidate, didn't you? Did you see...
They misplaced 16,000 of my votes. I was going to lead a march.
Storm the Capitol, mate.
Storm the Capitol, yeah.
But how did the... so how do your feelings about religion and about God intersect with that?
The Social Democratic Party is founded on Christian principles, Christian social policy, right back to Chesterton, Belloc, and before then to Aristotle. Obviously, this is what reform can't do. We have an ideology. We have a philosophical train of thought. They don't. They have Farage, and that's your lot.
Yes.
So that was always there. And it was always there when I was in the Labour Party, and Tony Benn, who I think probably was in his final years mad as a March hare, but nonetheless was a great proponent of Christian socialism.
He was.
And if you set him off on it, he would ramble about the Chartists and Wesley, and so it was always there, and it was always that my view was always that this society is unequal and it ought to be made more equal, that the poor get a rough deal, that there's a role for the state to play in ameliorating the differences between rich and poor, and in controlling things which should belong to all of us, such as the water and so on. But it's more recently, I suppose, that the advent of identitarian politics has meant that that's probably why you think I've become more socially conservative. I haven't. I was always the same. I was the first person on Teesside to join Rock Against Racism. So in 1976, I signed up. And that's because I find racism obnoxious.
It is.
To judge another person by the colour of their skin is an obnoxious thing to do. I didn't sign up to that to tell my children that they were oppressors and white supremacists, or to make sure that they were down the bottom of the queue when it came to getting jobs. That is obnoxious in itself.
It is.
It's racism to attack racism. Similarly, God forbid, I went on a gay pride march when they were called, what were they called? Shay. They were called Shay, do you remember?
Yes, I do.
Campaign for Homosexual Equality.
Yes.
Can't say the word homosexual anymore, of course.
No.
But I thought they shouldn't be beaten up.
No.
They shouldn't be discriminated against at work. But nor did I think that it was an equivalence to a male and female relationship. I didn't think they were the same. I didn't sign up to gay weddings, to gay adoptions,
pride has become a sort of monster.
It's become a monster, yeah.
And it's something which is, so it has become almost impossible on a public platform of any sort to declare yourself against this thing, because then you are automatically...
Except some very brave gay people have done that and
Yes.
set up LGB groups.
Well, that's true, and which is another sign, I suppose, where we can take a little bit of comfort. Anyway.
Oh, I think things are moving, and for me, race is the final one, which is the most problematic one, because it is full of so many utter lies, and people who attempt to counter those lies lose their jobs. Whether it be Nigel Biggar or whoever. And I remember during the time of the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020, when, of course, normal service was suspended because we had COVID, so there wasn't quite the same milieu, I was not really allowed ever to write about it.
Well, you're not.
Took a year. This was a time when, if you remember,
And this is
poor old
this
Alan
is
Shearer was forced to wear a BLM badge. BLM, buy larger mansions. A BLM badge on Match of the Day,
Yes.
and everyone was taking the knee.
Yes.
So this is a hideous absurdity.
it was, and it was it was one of those things where it was truly Orwellian.
Yeah.
In the way that people were actually coerced, forced into that position. So it's I think that there is a realization, isn't there? Something else which I think has become apparent to people is that the things which liberals hold dear, if you look at their lineage, so many of them can be traced back to the original spring, which is Christian teaching about how treating the other man decently.
Yeah.
And, so we are all, of course, racism is abhorrent and unintelligent.
But anti-racism has become perverted.
It has. That is indeed true. But the true, the idea of the brotherhood of man, the idea of treating you as I treat myself, this is the golden rule.
It is.
And this comes from, in our culture, very much from our Christian heritage.
Yeah, that's right.
And liberals actually, when you confront them with this, often they reject this idea.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they see Christianity and all that goes with it as in some way oppressive and coercive, and actually,
which is why the church has tried to connive with the identitarian left.
Absolutely.
And as a consequence, lost its audience.
The past is a foreign country, but they did some things better there.
Yes, they did.
Rod, thank you for your
Pleasure.
hospitality, and thank you for sharing this with us.
It wasn't a complete load of wank, was it? Would hate if it were. I've been measuring my language and thinking, Michael Azzanelli is watching this. Don't say cunt.
If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.